Hopefully everybody got a chance to have some food and relax and meet some new friends. My name is Peter Ruby. I'm a partner in the litigation group here, and more importantly, together with Allan Goodman, co-lead Goodman's technology group. And the genesis of this session really was when Mike Partridge, who's also in our technology group, and Allan, who does a lot of work with technology startups and on the M&A side of the business, and I were all in California and San Francisco and Silicon Valley recently, and we had dinner with this fellow over here, Brandon Lee, who Allan will introduce more properly in a minute, but as you can see on the screen is our Consul General in Northern California and Hawaii. You'll have to ask him which part of his job he enjoys the most. But the four of us had dinner, and everybody here knows those occasions when you sit down and you meet someone for the first time who is doing exciting things, who's doing things that really could make a difference, not just for the technology sector in Canada, but bringing closer technology in Canada to Silicon Valley, and we all know how important that is. And when Allan and Mike and I sat down with Brandon, we decided on the spot that we were going to do everything we can to give Brandon a platform so that you can get to know him and hear all the exciting things he's doing and his vision. So that's really what today was all about. Brandon was going to be in Toronto today, and we took advantage of that and invited him to come and speak with all of you. So without anything more, Allan's going to take Brandon through a discussion today. We're going to try and be informal and talk about his experience, and together with that, try and bring together some of the experience Goodman's technology group has had in the sector to try and get all of us to participate in this. There's one other thing Brandon mentioned that was part of his job. So he told us all the neat things he's doing in Silicon Valley. Do you know what else a consul spends a lot of time doing? Dealing with prisoners in California prisons. So we're not going to talk about that anymore. If anybody has questions about that, maybe privately, afterwards you can do it. Anyways, thank you, Allan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. As Peter said, this was something we were very excited about today, having met Brandon and hearing what he does down there. I think it's important. Goodman's tech practice has evolved on the emerging business side as we're legal counsel and residents at the DMZ. So we're actually spending a great deal of time with these startups and entrepreneurs as they're growing their businesses and understanding what it takes to become global. One of the criticisms for Canadian companies was that they don't think big enough. And I think what you're going to learn from Brandon, the role is to make that bridge, make that gap to get entrepreneurs over the hurdle. And so what we do is not only giving legal support to these companies at the DMZ, but mentorship. And part of this whole experience is to have everyone in this room network and understand what it takes, whether you're a company, an investor, or service provider, to get these Canadian companies over to the next hurdle, which is becoming big time players on the world stage. So with that, I could read Brandon's bio, but I think one of the first things we started to talk about when we first met Brandon, first of all, thank you for joining us, is really to hear about how does someone get to the position you're in today? What was this, and it is an interesting background, that's sort of the roadmap that took you to being in San Francisco today for the last year and a half. Maybe you can how did you get there?
With pleasure, actually, and thank you so much for having me. It's my honor to be here. I guess I had an atypical route to the position I am. So just as context, Consul General, we're heads of missions. So we oversee the entire Canadian government presence in our territories, and as mentioned, my territory is Northern California and Hawaii. But the way I even came to government, I was a former tech entrepreneur, and I worked in software consulting, and I was brought into government to help reform the government. So I like to say I've been disrupting the government from the inside. And having left the private sector, I thought, okay, I'll give it a year or two. And it's been 15 years since then. And so I was in global affairs, formerly Department of Foreign, DFAT, formerly DFAT-D. I was the first director of innovation, where I helped introduce crowdsourcing and just amazing innovative projects within the department. And for the past few years, I've been reforming at the international level. So I was in Geneva, where I reformed the World Trade Organization, and then afterwards I was brought to the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, where I did a global reform, 80 countries, 20,000 staff. So, and then so now I was asked to come, I was about to go back to private sector actually, and I was asked to come to San Francisco to help build bridges from Canada to the Silicon Valley for our innovation agenda.
So the role of Consul General, you've touched on it, but and I guess it's sort of two-pronged. What is formally the role, and traditionally what has been the role, and how have you sort of changed it given where you are in San Francisco?
That's a great question. So the title Consul General, this is a diplomatic title through the Vienna Convention. So we're heads of mission. So if I was based in a capital city, my title would be ambassador. In a large city, it's Consul General, and in a Commonwealth country, it's High Commissioner. But our function is to oversee and represent Canada. So traditionally, for example, we're OIC, Orders in Council appointments. So I am appointed by the Prime Minister, by Justin Trudeau, to be in San Francisco. So I've met with Governor Brown several times. I've overturned 2 California pieces of legislation that were anti-Canadian. And as mentioned, I have a person in death row that I'm a Canadian on death row, trying to get that person out. I oversee all consular passport activities. So every Canadian tourist that loses their passport on the weekend is lining up Monday morning at the consulate.
We'll send her out his email after.
But then what I'm focused on and what is my passion is helping bridge our innovation ecosystems across Canada to the Silicon Valley and vice versa. The number the amount of deal flow my office has been able to bring to Canada in the past about year and a half is a little over $900 million US. So the interest in Canada from Silicon Valley is enormous as well.
Right. In terms of the day one, is there a playbook? How do you know what you're supposed to be doing? Are you in training for a long time? How does this all play out?
Well, we receive 2 weeks training, and in the training, we're told basically when things hit the fan, this is who you call, this is what you do, and so, but we're all appointed based on our good judgment and our experience in government. You know, we're fortunate because our staff, our team at the consulates and embassies abroad, they're very good. So the management team, you ramp up very quickly. To be honest, you know, for myself, being a first-time head of mission, the first 6 months I was drinking from the fire hose regularly.
Right. So obviously, you know, people talk a lot of the time, Canadians in the Valley. We all know about C100, the organization that's designed to, you know, have prominent Canadians exposed to other Canadians to get them access. What is you know, we have our perception of what Canadians, how they're perceived in the Valley. What about the Americans? How do they perceive Canadians in the Valley, and what's their standing today? You know, when you walk around, how well known are we as prominent in the Valley in entrepreneurship?
You know, I'll answer that in 2 ways. I think we're known as the Canadian Mafia because we are everywhere. Canadian talents, for decades, I think Canadian universities have been producing world-class talent, engineering, scientific, academic talent across the board. So in the earlier years, a decade plus, maybe when Canada's innovation ecosystem wasn't as well developed, they were going where they were self-selecting, where they wanted to take risks and build big companies. And so naturally, the Silicon Valley was a draw for them. But then any startup founder, American that I meet, when I say I'm the Canadian Consul General, oh, my co-founder is a Canadian. I have 4 Canadians on my team. And we are across the board everywhere. But then one caveat I would say is, in the Valley, it's a true meritocracy. There are no favorites. You know, right now, Tesla, we know what is happening there. But if another company came up, disrupted Tesla or Google, nobody would blink an eye. It's the best wins. So in that way, we're everywhere, but it's because we're world class.
And obviously, it's daunting. You know, and especially in the world that we work in with the emerging companies, you hear Silicon Valley, but you know, to break into that, like I guess you get requests all the time from companies at different stages. How do you assess whether they're ready for the Valley and what it takes to get into the Valley?
That's a great question. So I guess if I start by answering just my consulate, we get 30 to 50 startups a week coming from across Canada. That's the volume of innovation that's being produced. And so these are the ones, one, that are leaving Canada. Many are flourishing and succeeding within Canada. And number two, those are the companies that my team has visibility on. So there's even more that we don't know about. So it's enormous, the innovation coming from Canada. Silicon Valley, though, is a global hub of innovation. Any ecosystem, they all want to be Silicon something. And it's because Silicon Valley has the smartest investors in the world, and it has an innovation ecosystem, this open innovation attitude and culture where you can meet with competitors, you can meet with people, everyone will give you a first meeting. They'll all meet you for a coffee. And so it's this way that I strongly recommend, so coming to your question directly now, to be successful in Silicon Valley, the deal flow is at such a level where investors, you have to have some sort of traction to get traction in the Valley. Generally, it's not an early stage ecosystem. So the minimum bar that we find is you've raised already $1 million, or you have revenues of $1 million, or your growth is the classic hockey stick, and you can prove that your growth is going this way. Then you are of interest to Silicon Valley. The second thing, because many of you know the venture capital world, they have to make returns before they raise their next fund. So they need to be able to show returns, 10x of their original investment within a few years. So in this way, the ideas that get traction in the Valley are global ideas. If your website is .ca and you're targeting, Canada, then likely the Silicon Valley won't be of that much interest. Even, companies that are flourishing in Canada, $1 million in sales, when they come, we have to often work with these startups to pivot their pitch, so then they're talking globally, and then they resonate much more.
So to that point, the things you do, is it a combination of networking, education, facilitating, customer opening doors for customers? Like, what is it that your office would do specifically for these companies when they come up?
Absolutely, that's a great question, and it's all of the above, but I would put it into 3 buckets maybe. The first is what everyone wants is deal flow, raising money. And on this, what we have is we have insight and context to who in the Valley is investing in what sectors. So the analyst you need to call. We know who has dry powder. We know who are easier and tougher investors. So then to build a bit of a pitch strategy, so your ideal target, save them for maybe your 20th or 30th pitch, and you can warm up with some others that are in your space. So that's around the financing. The second is around, actually the most important, I would say, is around mentorship. Because there's a Silicon Valley way of doing things, a Silicon Valley speed of doing things. And so when we bring companies into our orbit, we connect them with mentors and people who are successes and who are doing it or have done it in the Valley.
Are these typically Canadians?
Canadians and Americans, actually. So example, C100 is one that many of you know. We've just created one for the life sciences, because C100 is largely tech-based. Life sciences is a different sector, and they have a different way of operating, like clean tech does. So life sciences, we've just launched something called CELS, C-E-L-S, Canadian Entrepreneurs in Life Science. And that's the new C100 for life science companies. And so this mentorship piece, I think, is actually of most value. And then third is business development, sales, partnerships. For example, to meet Samsung's head of acquisition, you don't go to Seoul, Korea, you go to San Francisco, because it's the global hub. So these are the 3 areas we help companies.
So it's been a year and a half. It's still early in your, I guess, the 4-year mandate. What do you have you felt certain accomplishments, or is this a long-term plan that you're just trying to implement and leave behind for someone else? But have you seen successes in the first year and a half that you've been there?
That's a great question. So I think my personal vision, and I think the vision of this government as well, is it's Canada's time. It's an exciting time for Canada now. And in a way, this government is in a mode of nation building 101. Because of the digital economy, the industrial revolution, whatever you want to call it, we are trying to set up Canada for success in the long term, in the new digital economy. So in that way, my mandate, my personal mandate, is to set up some key projects and pillars for my successor to continue to build Canada's innovation ecosystem upon. But in the short term, we've had great successes, actually. Recently, Canada we've had one of the biggest Series A in Canadian history with Element AI in Montreal.
Last week.
And then a few months ago, Thalmic Labs had the biggest Series B in Canadian history. And so Intel Capital is one of our clients. And we've been bringing Intel Capital to Canada, introducing them to our incredibly rich ecosystem here. So as I mentioned quickly, we've brought over $900 million US in the past year and a half of new money into Canada. So that's on top of the regular deal flow that's happening.
So you mentioned at lunch that you were in Ottawa last week. How involved are you in the the innovation agenda is top priority for the Trudeau government. How involved are you in that, and what input do you have, and what feedback do you get from the government on that?
Yes, so I'm involved on a number of levels. I think we've been having almost a ministerial visit a week. So in that way, I get to shape ministers' insights into what the Silicon Valley is doing. And a number of ministers have come away from visits with either pivoted or adjusted positions that they have matured themselves on. And then in terms of Minister Baines' innovation agenda, there are a number of programs underneath, several of which I am feeding into and providing some input, both from a policy perspective and from a Silicon Valley perspective.
So it's interesting because obviously if we're going to build an innovation economy here, we want to have global companies, but we want them in Canada, right? And I guess there's a big attraction. Everybody wants to have an address in Silicon Valley, et cetera. What kind of dynamic is that when you're talking to companies? Like, come down here, meet people, get money, but stay home because we want to build it here. Like, that must be a very interesting dynamic.
Absolutely, it is. And this is one we've been chewing on for some time. But so generally where we've come on this is the Silicon Valley is a unique ecosystem, and being the country closest to the Silicon Valley, we have to take advantage of this. So we encourage companies to come often, but come for a short period of time. Learn, meet the people, then go back to your cities and build in Canada. Because, in fact, Canada, we have natural advantage. In Silicon Valley, they are smart. They know how to commercialize technology. That is what Silicon Valley is great at. They have money and they know how to commercialize. How many people in Canada have grown a business from 50 million to 500 million, or 500 million to billion plus? Not a large handful. But in Silicon Valley, it's almost every coffee shop. There's a number of people that have done this. So the commercialization of technology is what we need to leverage in the Silicon Valley. But then we're seeing, 10 years ago, an investor would say, you're a Canadian company, that's great, move to the Valley and I'll invest in you, because they have to manage your investment. But now what we're seeing, in fact, many VCs tell me not to wave the Canadian flag too broadly, because they think that's their secret advantage. As long as you have a sales, business development, or your CEO, C-suite are in the Valley, if you establish operations in Canada, you can stretch out their investment dollars a lot further. An example of this is I was just meeting with an American company who moved to Canada. They have a 5-person business development sales office in the Valley and a 45-person office in Waterloo. It costs them the same to manage these.
I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't raise it, but obviously with the political landscape changing, have you sensed a change in talent that's willing to either go back to Canada or not even look at the Valley, or how has it changed the dynamic in terms of the tech industry, if at all yet?
I think we're seeing it across the board, actually. And so part of our innovation strategy is to make Canada a global center of innovation. So of course what we're seeing in the US, a lot of investors, academics, a lot of families are thinking of Canada. The Canadians that are there, every Canadian I speak to, they love Canada. And they one day want to move back. And so a lot of those Canadians are moving back as well. But what we're seeing is we're getting interest from around the world into Canada. If you look at our universities, interest, enrollment, international applicants are up across the board. Every program that I speak to, whether it be Ryerson here, U of T, or across Canada, the international applicants are from across the board as well.
So what are some, would you top 1, 2, 3 challenges when a Canadian gets on that plane for the first time and shows up and they've connected with you and they wanted an introduction to money or to a customer? What's the biggest challenge? I mean, we all recognize it's ominous to some people, but they have to find their way through this. But what would you say is the number one reason that companies from Canada can't succeed? Is it not thinking globally? Is it not having the ability to understand this, the differences? What are the biggest challenges?
I think, yeah, I would say 2 things. The biggest challenge is probably the global commercialization business plan. No matter what company comes, I think that's when I speak to investors and VCs in the Valley, they love the Canadian talent. The ideas, the intellectual property is world class. Right. But then that commercialization dimension is where they see some room for improvement generally. And so part 2 of what Canadians need to do is to be more tenacious, more confident. Know that no company gets it the first time, but you only have to get it right once and then your company is off and running. So to come often, to be tenacious. An example, one of the major investors in the Valley, a name brand investor, I asked him about Canadian deal flow, and he says, Canadians tell him to be much more confident. He used a different word, but I'll say confident. Because, for example, and I see it as well, when a Canadian company will say, I connected with this investor on LinkedIn. I sent him, a LinkedIn message a week ago. Should I follow up? What should I? And then he tells me he has Indian and Chinese founders calling him twice a day for a 15-minute meeting. And so an investor needs to have confidence that that founder will pound the pavement and do what it takes to make that company successful. And so that pain in the ass that's calling twice a day, they will probably do that to all their clients, all their customers, and continue to make their product successful. Because we can't only rely on the quality of our science and technology. It's the business. We're running businesses, so we need to up our confidence on the business side.
Interesting. So tell us about a typical day in the life of the Consul General. How does that play out? Is it different every day? Are there certain things you guys try to accomplish every month in terms of events? Or, as you say, you've got a minister a week coming down. How does that all, tell us how that works.
This is a world that even before I was appointed to, I didn't have much insight, even though I worked in global affairs. But the typical day is an amazing variety of activities. For example, every hour I'll be meeting a different counterpart, from the Strawberry Association of California to labor immigration, then to an investor, then to a hot Canadian startup that is in territory. I have 4 to 6 diplomatic and trade events a day, 4 to 6 invitations. So for my wife and I to have a quiet dinner alone, I have to say no to every single event. So we've gone from, and this includes weekends as well. So we've gone from having a quiet weekend together to having a quiet dinner together. So it's amazing, but it's it's invigorating, actually.
And so the staff you mentioned is a key part of this. So what are the various areas that they cover and they do? And I guess they outlast the mandate. They're there longer than you are, so they've got the history. So tell us a bit about the staff. And what they do.
Absolutely. So generally, there are 4 groups in any embassy consulate setup. So I have a political section. So this is where the piece of legislation meeting with governors and the political apparatus. And then we have our consular services. And then there's the mission management. And then the trade section are the 4 main. And then other embassies we've regionalized also have an immigration section. But in our operation in San Francisco, I have 2 offices, one in the city and one in the valley. And the trade is, of course, the biggest program that we have there.
Now, Peter mentioned it. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that, but you also cover Hawaii. Let's talk about that. How much time do you spend there? What's your mandate there? How does that all tie into this particular mandate?
Absolutely. So every head of mission in the U.S., all the states are covered by one of us. So my territory, so it's a real hardship posting that I have covering California and Hawaii. So it's to keep relations with Hawaii, political, diplomatic, and trade relations. So I go about 2 or 3 times a year. But now, given what's happened at the federal level in the U.S., Hawaii is the most democratic state in the U.S. They have a climate change target of 100%. So in fact, they resonate strongly with our Canadian goals of climate change. So I'll likely be going a little more often now.
So tech opportunities exist that we should all know about. What are the, we talked about some of the challenges, but what would you say are, Canadian strong points when it comes to coming down to the valley? What is it that distinguishes us that does get some of this money? Because we are attracting the AI and that. And I know you did mention we have great intellectual property, but there must be some other factors that resonate. Is it just the geography? Is it it's cheaper to invest here?
So in terms of Canada to the valley, what's interesting?
Yeah, what's interesting to people in the U.S. about Canadians and wanting to invest here?
So the number one, far and away reason is our talent. Our engineering and scientific talent is world class, and this is often there's a bit of a tall poppy syndrome, or sometimes Canada, we see ourselves as second to Silicon Valley or New York or some of these global centers. But one thing, every single time I speak to any group in Canada is have a lot of confidence. You are world class. In the Silicon Valley, Waterloo University is probably the 3rd most recruited from university globally. Stanford, MIT, and Waterloo are the highest recruited universities in the valley. So our culture also, so our talent is there, but our culture is, if you look at most international organizations, NGOs, even corporate, even the multinational corporate worlds, Canadians often are in the senior management of these organizations. And I think it's because of our cultural open-mindedness, our flexibility, our willingness to work together and come up with a solution. I think this makes us extremely valuable, actually, in the Silicon Valley.
One thing we notice, and people who haven't been down there may not understand that, but everyone talks about the Valley and Menlo Park in that area. But San Francisco's had a revitalization. Some companies are now moving back there, and there's sort of, I guess part of it is just density and the need to not want to travel back and forth. But do you see a distinction between what's happening in San Francisco and the Valley? Is it divided by types of companies, or is it divided by companies versus VCs? How's that playing out?
That's a good insight, actually, and we are seeing this. So we're seeing earlier stage startups generally moving back to the city. I think because from Palo Alto down to Menlo Park, that whole area, the cost of living is astronomical. And in fact, a lot of startups, they want a bit of nightlife, and so they're all coming back to the city, generally speaking. The investors, the money is staying in the valley, on Sand Hill Road, actually, almost on one road. But then we are seeing, there are sectoral differences where life sciences is starting to build in certain areas, closer to the valley and near the airport there. But then pure tech plays are largely coming to the city. So we're seeing a migration.
So we've got in the room companies, investors, et cetera. Somebody says, it's time, we're ready, we've got the thresholds, we want to come down to the valley. What do they do? Do they send you an email? Do they say, we're coming, help us? Like, how does that actually work?
That's a great question. And I would strongly recommend a two-prong approach. The first is get connected here locally into the government ecosystems. So we have regional offices across Canada. And there's something in the diplomatic corps called the Trade Commissioner Service. Just by a show of hands in this room, who knows about the Trade Commissioner Service? Yeah, just a few people. So this, I would say, in terms of if you're a company, if you have clients, this is your secret weapon. The Trade Commissioner Service, I had mentioned my program, so this is my trade program. Trade commissioners are in every single consulate and embassy and high commission in the world. And their job is to connect with companies. So it's not, do you know somebody in Tata or in Samsung or in GE? Through the Trade Commissioner Service, we know every single person in every single country in these companies. So get connected through the regional offices into the Trade Commissioner Service. And when they know what you're looking for, your plan may be to come to Silicon Valley, where I am. But our regional office can tell you, based on your plan, we have 3 investors in New York, 2 in Boston, and 4 in Silicon Valley we're going to introduce you to. And they can connect you into our global network. So this is connect first locally, share with them what your business goals are, then you can leverage the global platform, of which Silicon Valley is an important part.
You talked about this, and this has come up in other of these similar forums we've had, that the big issue for Canadians is not the technology, it's getting scale. Scale is a big, big issue. On that front, I mean, it's nice to talk about it, but what kind of relationships can you introduce to people to help them with that? Is it talent on the commercialization front? Is it money to help them commercialize? Like, what is it that actually helps them implement that? Because it's one thing to say they need it. I think that's the biggest issue for Canadians, I agree. But how do you actually make that happen?
You're absolutely right. And in fact, that's why when I spoke about the 3 buckets of things we offer, it's mentorship. You have to speak to someone who's done it before. And so, for example, scaling, the C100 now was at their retreat and their board meeting. And in fact, we agreed that CEOs have a lot of support, especially when a startup is in scale-up mode. Those CEOs have a lot of support and they have a lot of visibility. But say you're a CEO that's raised 20 million and you have to go from 15 people to 60 people. The CEO will be doing a lot of this, but your head of HR, your chief operations officer, your CFO, it's your CEO -1 level that has to do a lot of the heavy lifting, actually. And it's that level where the mentorship is actually needed to scale. And that's where, when I said earlier, how many people have taken a $50 million business to $500 million? If you haven't done it, it's like, trial and error, finding your way through a black forest. Someone who's done it 4 times and has exited 3, they've IPO'd once, one 30-minute conversation with them can be the difference between bankruptcy and success, or can take away 2 years of hardship. So that's why this mentorship piece, and that's why Silicon Valley is so important to come to speak to these people.
I guess another piece of scale is actually customer contacts and customer connections. Sometimes you just need that one big customer to get you going and get the revenue. On that front, beyond introductions, do you provide any help? Is it, whether it's with respect to helping them figure out an agreement that works from a Canadian company perspective, or is it just simply the introduction stage?
No, absolutely. And that's, I guess, the third bucket, where it's introduction to sales and business development. And we do a number of things. For example, AIG, the large insurance company, we held an AIG challenge where we agreed, we got AIG to agree to give $50,000 to whoever was most interesting to them. And they brought their entire leadership cadre, and we lined up companies, and they adjusted their pitch for the insurance AIG world. So we had blockchain, drone, all kinds of technologies, aligned to the insurance world, and then by the end of it, almost every company had some kind of partnership. They were going to be piloted, integrated into AIG, and of course the first prize winner got 50K, which is nice. We do high energy, high effort activities like this too. We do something called a double-ended introductions. So we ask our global corporate partners what tech and what startups they're interested in. Once we know this, we go across Canada to all those regional offices and we say, what Canadian technologies are aligned? And then we ask the Canadian companies, do you want to meet with XYZ? And so we get a yes to both sides. It takes a little more work, but it's double curated. And the success we're seeing from this kind of introduction is enormous. This is why we've been able to bring so much money into Canada.
It's incredibly helpful. Another piece of this, obviously, is immigration. I mean, everyone talking about getting closed there. At the same time, the Canadian government is opening up access to make it quicker, faster for talent. As a result of that, first of all, are you able to facilitate if somebody wants to come down for 6 months? Is there ways to do that on a tech basis, or do they just have to go through the regular program? Is that something you can facilitate?
That's a great question, and I think immigration is a huge issue. Even these NAFTA renegotiations that are upcoming, immigration is part of this because of the NAFTA visa requirements. But recently, I don't know if everyone here has heard, we've just released a 2-week business visa program in Canada. So Canadian companies can recruit internationally within 10 business days. So this is putting Canada, this is why I mentioned Canada, we want to become a global hub of innovation. And it's things like this that are helping us. When it comes to immigration, we'll have to see what NAFTA renegotiations happen there. But traveling, visiting from Canada, I think is fairly easy for the moment. So quick visits, 2-3 days, stay for a week, and come back to Canada, I think is a good strategy.
So longer term, and we've talked about some of the short-term issues, the benefits, the difficulties. What's the long-term vision? Where do we want to see Canada vis-a-vis Silicon Valley 5-10 years from now, long after you may be gone? But like, what is the goal here? Is it more to have Canadian, U.S. access to Canadian companies and sending money this way, or is it have more of a Canadian presence in the Valley? What is sort of the long-term vision when you talk about the agenda?
Longer term, I think it would be for Canada to be known as an international or a global hub of innovation. And I think we're starting by putting the Canadian flag in certain sectors. So sectorally, if you look at some of our natural advantages like artificial intelligence, machine learning, we're already a global hub. Recently the Creative Destruction Labs held their annual conference where I came down, a number of Silicon Valley VCs, AI VCs came down, and they said even the Valley couldn't have held something of this caliber.
Wow.
So already we're on the global map for AI, machine learning. Life sciences, our science, in the medical life sciences field is world-class. Brain science is there. We have opportunity in ag tech, in fintech. There are some areas where we have a natural advantage. So the medium long term is when we would like to see global companies opening up global headquarters in Canada, because the talent is here and the action is happening in Canada. I think financing, money-wise, the Silicon Valley will always be the one of the global centers for financing. So when it gets to scaling, or when it gets to, how many people can write a $200 million check in Canada? So when it comes to certain large financing deals, I think we should always keep our Silicon Valley connections. And then the experience is there. So until we can create enough experience in Canada, we definitely need to continue that.
Do you see the geography, like Eastern Canada, 3-hour time difference? People shy away because they say, well, as opposed to, is there any difference between companies from Western Canada and Eastern Canada when it comes to the Valley? Does it make
a little bit, actually. But in fact, it's right now, because it's the early birth of the digital economy, it's making less of a difference. Even VCs will fly across the continent and then go to different time zones to see what opportunities lie. What we are seeing, and what I'd recommend, is actually we're seeing vertical movement a little more. So it's easier to go from Toronto, Montreal to New York than it is to come to the Valley. But of course, they are coming to the Valley. But I would say to Canada, to Canadian companies, think horizontal instead of thinking US as your second. Companies in Toronto should think about Montreal and Vancouver and even Calgary. There's talent in Ottawa. There's great cybersecurity coming out of Ottawa. Think horizontal across Canada because there's a lot of money, there's a lot of new money, there's a lot of attention. And governments, municipal, provincial, and federal, are all aligned, actually. So it's an incredible time. You know, in the political theater, I think we're seeing things happening politically, but when it comes to innovation, all of Canada is aligned.
It was interesting. You mentioned at lunch, you've got the government of Alberta, the ministers or mayor coming of Edmonton. I guess, are Canadians aligned in that sense when they come down to you, or is everybody sort of looking out for their own interests? I mean, I don't know whether Alberta would have a different interest from companies from Ontario, but obviously maybe from the resource sector, having technologies apply in that sense. But that's interesting because you're getting all these people coming down. Are there competing agendas amongst the country?
Absolutely. And in fact, what we're seeing works is when even cities, municipalities, and provinces put their flag in something. When I first arrived, the first few visits, you know, a mayor or a premier would say, I would ask, what is your province or city good at? And they'll say everything. But in the Silicon Valley, that means nothing, actually. That means you're early. So what we worked on, and we've been working on, is, okay, then let's pick a sector to really plant our flag in. And we can look globally for best practices, you know, like Tel Aviv, cybersecurity, they put their flag in it. So any cybersecurity company coming to the Valley will get a meeting with anyone now because they know the quality of that kind of company coming out of Israel now. So we're already getting, any AI company in Canada, you can get a meeting, you know, and we have natural strengths like agriculture. We're a global superpower in agriculture. So ag tech would be a natural extension of our innovation agenda globally for Canada. Life sciences were there, and a number of other sectors.
I'm going to open it up to questions soon, but before I do, I just wanted to get sort of a key, we've talked about a number of them, the sort of key takeaways, keeping in mind the audience here varies from service providers to companies that are raising money to companies that are looking to invest. What's the number one thing that they should take away vis-a-vis, you know, we talked about this in somewhat, accessing the Valley, but when they think about when's the right time, what should I do, when should I come, like what would you say is the number one thing they should keep in mind?
On this one, and maybe thinking of our audience here as well, the Silicon Valley is the Olympics of tech. The whole world is sending their best companies. And some context to come to your question. The average VC sees between 2,000 to 5,000 deals per year in their narrow sector. So by the time a Canadian company comes, within 3 seconds, I am a wearable, an industrial IoT, a SaaS solution provider. Within 10 seconds, that investor knows your sector, your competitors, your market opportunity better than the company probably. That's why it's considered smart money. If you raise Silicon Valley money, you get Silicon Valley validation because they see every deal in the world. Right. Now, to answer your question, because they see, so imagine you see 2,000 companies. These are 2,000 Silicon Valley caliber companies. So the top 200 are great companies. So this is where, if your terms are not correctly set up, if your pitch is not great, if you present obstacles that put you at a disadvantage, even if your tech is amazing, there's 199 others that the investor can invest in without blinking an eye. So there's no such thing as, you know, a company that says, I have no competitors. There's no such thing. A company that says, we are the only ones in this space, there's no such thing. And so just to know that maybe in your respective city, you know, wherever you're from in Canada, There may not be a lot of others in your space, but in the Silicon Valley, there's at least a couple dozen in the exact space you're in. And so this is where mentorship, again, is so important. Talking to service providers who know how to write deal flow and terms that resonate in the Silicon Valley. Because an investor will do business the way the Silicon Valley does business. So to rewrite, all for example, how shares are divided. Most investors don't like common shares, actually. They need some kind of shared structure.
Right.
But if you come as a startup and your seed series was with all common shares, just to rewrite this, backtrack out of this and redo it, if there's another Indian company in the exact same space, they'll invest there. Because when you're sitting under the apple tree and the apples are falling all around you, the Canadian apple may be delicious, but there are many other apples just to choose from.
It's interesting you say about mentorship. The nice thing about the ecosystem, as we're seeing, in the last couple of years, is the fact that people have done it that are here. So you don't have to go to Silicon Valley for that mentorship anymore, whereas even through the DMZ, we're seeing people getting connected to those that have sold a business once, gone IPO. And so having that here to lean on, even before you go down, I can see as being a huge advantage, because as you say, you get one 15-minute shot at it, and you don't want to blow it.
Absolutely.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I thought this would be a good time to open this up for questions and see if any of the audience has anything they'd like to ask Brandon while he's here. Sure. Just grab me a mic so that they can hear you online.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jeff Charlton. I run a firm called FlexSurf. This year, a software engineering grad out of Waterloo will make $90,000 if they work in Canada, and the equivalent of $147,000 Canadian if they work in the Valley. This is a great thing for the student graduating, but maybe not as good for Canada in the long term. I think you mentioned one of the potential solutions is convincing some of those companies there to open up operations here. Can you tell us, is there any coordinated government policy or actions taking place to accelerate the number of companies that are establishing operations here?
If I can answer your question in two quick parts. One, to answer directly, yes. So the business visa, the 2-week business visa program is exactly, if you're a tech company anywhere in the world, to open an office or operations in Canada, you can recruit any skilled worker within 10 business days. So this is very interesting for businesses. We have Invest in Canada, an investment branch specifically targeted and focused on bringing investment into Canada, in exactly what you say. But the salary that you raise is actually very important. And for any founders in the room here, if we're going to build a global ecosystem in Canada, we have to pay global salaries. So when you're raising your round, say the average salary is $80,000 in whatever city you're in. If you decide to pay $85,000, you're competitive only in your local area. You have to pay, if the salary you say is $150 in the Valley, if you want to be competitive, raise your round at $160K. This is how you get global talent coming into your location in Canada. So we have to up our game. And it's really just a matter of your business plan, thinking through what kind of talent you want. Do you want to be competitive within your city or across Canada or internationally? And in this way, I think we have to be globally minded from day one. And this goes to that global business plan again.
Yeah, it goes back to Canadians being shy and thinking only in our space. But you're right. If you want to hire the best person from Silicon Valley, put that in your raise.
You have to pay Silicon Valley rates. And it's happening, and I'm seeing Silicon Valley people come to Canada. Not Canadians, Americans, and third country nationals coming to Canada because they can earn the quality of life and standard of living that they're earning in the Valley.
Other questions? Yep. Oh, just one sec. We'll grab you a mic. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Norm Capel from Borrowell. Quick question. Given that Canadians tend to go to the Valley for later stage financing, is there a particular type of investor that the Valley likes to see in the early financings done in Canada?
That's a good question.
That's a good question. I think it's not atypical, actually. I think the Silicon Valley, they look for what kind of founder. They look for the passion, and if they're going to put in money, can you grow a company? So one thing typically maybe to give advice to early stage companies, investors, they don't need to know, even if you have one slide on your technical solution, that's more than enough. The rest of your pitch needs to be the business, the commercialization aspect of it. A lot of companies come and they have a 15-slide deck and 13 is a technical solution, and that's not what the Silicon Valley looks for. These investors, they're experts themselves. Once you say what your technology is, what your space is, it has to be all about commercialization. So if you can present commercialization with a global view, then even at the early stages, it's to your advantage. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I think I'm asking also whether there's a particular kind of validation or particular kind of support they already want to see in your capital structure.
I see. So in this way, you know, the investors don't move quickly. When you look at the average VC, and I said they see between 2,000 and 5,000 deals a year, they make 10 to 12 investments out of that 2,000 to 5,000. And that 10 to 12 investments, most of them they're not leading on, they're piggybacking on their colleagues. So they're leading on maybe 2 or 3 that they've seen in the entire year. So when you come, you'll have to meet with many VCs, because as soon as you leave the room, they pick up the phone and they call their competitors and they talk about you as soon as you leave the room. And so if you have early validation, so this goes back to
Who's already invested in it.
exactly having some kind of investment. Who are your angels? And they see, have you been validated? Is it a high net worth? Is it an early stage VC? Is it someone that has credibility? That's why, you know, if we look at Russia or China, you could raise $1 billion fund in these countries. There's a lot of money, but is it smart money? Is it smart capital? We're seeing smarter, but it's not Silicon Valley caliber. So there's so much deal flow. It's the validation. So it depends on who you've raised with, who are your advisors, who is on your board, who is your management team, have they done it before? If your entire management team have never exited, have never sold a company, then that's a lot more work for them. So these are some of the indicators that they'll look for.
I mean, on the flip side, what we've seen is having a certain type of investor gets the door open for you. It works the other way. That once they've invested, you get to access their network. So I find it from the other side, it's very helpful. Maybe not so much from that side, but certainly we've seen in companies succeed because X or Y or Z. If Mars is in your fund, people recognize that. They see that as an early incubator. So that it's been a help from that perspective. It certainly can't hurt you.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. We see a lot of valuation differences across Canada, and I know that there's a big valuation difference between the Valley and Canadian firms. How should Canadian firms really prepare themselves for deal structure, and more importantly, the valuation differences that Silicon Valley VCs generally see of the 2,000 companies in one vertical?
You know, instead of giving a targeted answer, because this is a very important question, and in fact, valuation is often something where Canadian companies are often misaligned when they come to the Valley. So this is, again, you know, our mentorship and support services, our advice we're giving our startups has to be in tune with Silicon Valley. So my best advice I can give is, that's why it's important to come to Silicon Valley often, because every sector, over time, every few months, every few weeks, the smartest money, they're adjusting how they value companies. And every action, like we just saw Amazon bought Whole Foods. And we're seeing, you know, these huge tech companies enter retail and trying to own the retail space. This will change, again, the valuations in food tech, in ag tech. Every action changes, so we have to have strong links, actually. Because my answer to you now, if I give you a specific answer, in 4 to 6 months, it'll change, actually. And it's evolving very quickly. Generally, it's because it's opportunity-based, the valuations are based on the future of the digital economy. So a lot of areas will think Silicon Valley is in a bubble. But in this way, I'm actually, maybe I've drank the Kool-Aid too much in Silicon Valley, but I'm actually in agreement with we are building economies and sectors that don't even exist, and every sector will be disrupted. So I believe in the valuations that take that into consideration. But the valuation is extremely important. That's another thing. If you come with a valuation that's way off, if you're seeing 200 companies and one valuation is way off, it's too much work for an investor to have that discussion. You just move on to the next. So you have to have your valuation ballpark right.
Does that work both ways? If the valuation is too low, or do they just snap you up?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Any more questions? All right, then. Well, listen, I want to, on behalf of Goodman's, thank you very much for this. I think this was quite informative, and people now know how to reach you when they lose their passport, and more importantly, if they ever need to come down to the Valley.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.